January 7th, 1945. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery stood before reporters at his headquarters in Belgium. He wanted to set the record straight about the Battle of the Bulge, about his role in stopping the German offensive, about what really happened when the Americans needed help. Montgomery spoke for nearly an hour. He repeatedly used the phrase, "I handled," when describing the battle. He made it sound like American forces had been in disarray until British command arrived to organize the defense. He dismissed American contributions and positioned himself as the savior of the Western Front. The reaction was explosive. Within 24 hours, General Omar Bradley was drafting his resignation. Within 48 hours, Winston Churchill was scrambling to save the alliance. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower had drafted an order relieving Montgomery of command. One press conference had nearly destroyed the Allied command. Montgomery's arrogance had brought the Western Alliance to the brink of collapse. Churchill had to deliver an emergency speech in Parliament praising American sacrifice to prevent an international crisis. But 4 months earlier, 2 Allied offensives had ended in costly disasters. 2 commanders had failed. 2 sets of casualty lists had been sent to families. But only 1 commander would face consequences. September 1944. Montgomery launched Operation Market Garden. In 9 days, 17,000 Allied soldiers became casualties. The operation failed completely. American generals were furious about the wasted resources and lives, but there was no crisis, no relief orders drafted. Montgomery kept his command. That same month, General Omar Bradley launched an offensive into the Huertgen Forest. For 5 months, American divisions were fed into a meat grinder. By January 1945, when Montgomery held his disastrous press conference, Bradley's offensive had consumed 33,000 American casualties, nearly double what Montgomery lost at Market Garden. Entire divisions destroyed fighting for worthless forest, a strategic objective that should have been bypassed entirely. Bradley was never questioned. No one suggested he should be fired. Eisenhower stood by his longtime friend throughout the grinding attrition battle. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Montgomery's arrogant press conference nearly ended his career. Bradley's costly battlefield failure never put him in danger. Why would Eisenhower tolerate massive battlefield casualties from his favorite commander, but nearly fire Montgomery over words? To understand the double standard, we must look at September 1944. Montgomery had sold Operation Market Garden as the operation that would end the war by Christmas. The plan was audacious. 3 Allied airborne divisions would drop behind German lines to capture bridges at Eindhoven, Nijmegen, and Arnhem. British armored forces would race up a single highway connecting the bridges. If any bridge wasn't captured, the entire operation would fail. It required perfection. Montgomery promised perfection. Eisenhower gave him everything he asked for. Priority for supplies. 3 American airborne divisions under British command. Total air superiority. The entire Allied offensive effort focused on Montgomery's plan. The operation launched September 17th, 1944. The 101st Airborne captured bridges at Eindhoven. The 82nd Airborne seized the bridge at Nijmegen after fierce fighting. But at Arnhem, disaster struck. 2 SS Panzer divisions were refitting in the area. German resistance was overwhelming. British paratroopers were surrounded before relief could reach them. For 9 days, the British 1st Airborne held against impossible odds. They were waiting for relief that would never come. They ran out of ammunition. They ran out of food. They ran out of hope. On September 25th, the survivors withdrew. Of 10,000 British paratroopers who landed at Arnhem, only 2,400 escaped. The rest were killed or captured. Total Allied casualties exceeded 17,000. American airborne divisions lost thousands. British forces were devastated. Polish paratroopers were nearly wiped out. The strategic result was nothing. No breakthrough, no advance into Germany. Montgomery's promise had been empty. American generals were livid. Patton called it a waste of American airborne divisions. Bradley questioned why his armies had been starved of supplies for Montgomery's failed plan. But there was no formal crisis. No discussion of removing Montgomery from command. The frustration remained private. Montgomery kept his job and immediately began blaming the weather, intelligence failures, and insufficient American support. Eisenhower was disappointed, but accepted the failure as part of war's uncertainties. The alliance required maintaining British morale. Montgomery would keep his command. Within days, Market Garden faded from immediate attention. There were other battles to fight. The Allied advance would continue. But as Market Garden ended, American forces were entering a nightmare of their own, one that would last far longer than 9 days and cost far more lives, and the commander responsible would never face consequences. September 1944. The same month, Market Garden launched. General Omar Bradley turned his attention to the Huertgen Forest, 50 square miles of dense woodland along the German-Belgian border. It sat directly in the path of the American advance toward Germany. Bradley's staff presented alternatives. They could bypass the forest entirely, encircle it, let the trapped Germans wither without supplies. This was the approach Patton favored. Bradley refused. He argued that Germans controlled the Roer River dams upstream from the forest. If Americans bypassed it, Germans could flood the valley and trap advancing forces. The forest had to be taken by direct assault. It was logical. It was also catastrophically wrong. American forces entered the forest in mid-September. They immediately discovered hell. The forest neutralized every American advantage. Armor was useless, artillery was ineffective, air support couldn't see targets. Visibility was measured in yards. German bunkers were invisible until soldiers walked into their fire. Artillery shells burst in the tree canopy 50 feet up, sending thousands of wooden splinters and metal fragments straight down. Foxholes offered no protection. Veterans said it sounded like the forest itself was screaming. The splinters weren't just wood. They were jagged stakes, sometimes 3 feet long. Men weren't just killed. They were pinned to the earth by the trees that were supposed to cover them. There was no digging in. There was nowhere to hide. The Germans had spent months preparing defenses. Every bunker covered the approaches with interlocking machine gun fire. Every trail was covered by mortars. Every clearing was pre-registered for artillery. This wasn't Market Garden's dramatic 9-day failure. This was a grinding 5-month attrition battle where divisions went in and came out destroyed. The 9th Infantry Division, 4,500 casualties. Then came the 28th Infantry Division in November 1944. The Keystone Division from Pennsylvania. They expected a quick push through the forest. Instead, they walked into a killing ground. On November 3rd, elements of the 28th actually captured the town of Schmidt, deep in the forest. For a few hours, breakthrough seemed possible. Then the German counterattack hit. Panzers came up the forest roads. German infantry infiltrated American positions. The isolated units in Schmidt were cut off and surrounded. The withdrawal became a rout. Units retreated in disorder. Entire companies were overrun. By November 8th, the 28th Infantry Division had been destroyed. Over 6,000 casualties in 6 days. That was 40% of their strength. Entire battalions ceased to exist. The survivors called the division the Bloody Bucket. after that. The Keystone shoulder patch looked like a red bucket. It became a grim reminder of what the forest could do to experienced divisions. Combat veterans from Normandy said the Huertgen was worse. At least in Normandy you could see the enemy. In the forest, visibility was feet. There was no room to maneuver. You attacked straight into prepared defenses or stayed in your hole and waited to die. The 28th was pulled out and sent to a quiet sector to rebuild. That sector was the Ardennes. 1 month later, the Germans would launch their surprise offensive there. But in November, the lesson was clear. The Huertgen Forest was a meat grinder, and Bradley kept feeding divisions into it. By December 1st, American casualties exceeded 25,000. The advance measured barely 5 miles. The Roer River dams were still miles away. Bradley's strategic justification was proving hollow. More divisions were committed. The 4th Infantry Division, the 8th Infantry Division, the 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions moved into position for early December attacks. The meat grinder kept operating until the Germans made Bradley's strategic error catastrophically clear. While Bradley ground divisions to pieces in the Huertgen Forest, General George Patton sat to the south, watching the disaster unfold with fury. Patton's Third Army had swept across France after the Normandy breakout. They had liberated huge sections of the country using speed and encirclement. By late September, Third Army had reached the German border, positioned to drive into the industrial Saar region. Then the fuel stopped coming. Eisenhower had prioritized supplies for Montgomery's Market Garden operation and Bradley's Huertgen offensive. Patton's tanks sat idle with empty gas tanks. Patton was livid. His forces were ready to advance. The Germans in front of him were disorganized and retreating. This was exactly the moment to push hard. Instead, he was ordered to halt while Montgomery prepared his elaborate operation and Bradley attacked into the forest. Patton hated everything about the Huertgen offensive. It violated every principle he believed in. Attack enemy weakness, not strength. Use speed and bypass fortified positions. Keep moving and never let the enemy establish defensive lines. The Huertgen Forest was the opposite. Frontal assault into prepared defenses. Fighting on ground that favored the enemy. Trading American lives for worthless territory. When Patton looked at the Huertgen Forest, he saw an obvious solution. Go around it. The forest wasn't tactically important. Bypass it and let the trapped Germans withdraw or starve. The Americans would gain the ground without the casualties, or just leave a screening force, and advance on both flanks. Force the Germans to abandon the forest to avoid encirclement. Patton proposed these alternatives to Bradley. Bradley rejected them. The dams had to be captured. The forest had to be taken by direct assault. Patton argued the dams could be destroyed by air power. That flooding the valley would be temporary. That months of fighting in the forest would cost more than working around flooded terrain. Bradley wouldn't listen. The decision was made. The attack would continue. Patton wrote in his diary that Bradley was making a terrible mistake, that the casualty lists would prove him right, that attacking into the forest was exactly the kind of unimaginative, frontal assault that prolonged wars and killed soldiers. He was completely correct. But Bradley was his superior officer. Patton could only watch as the disaster unfolded and remember that he had tried to warn them. By late November, after Market Garden had failed and the Huertgen offensive had stalled, Patton finally received enough supplies to resume operations. But by then, the weather had turned. The Germans had reinforced. The opportunity for rapid advance had passed. Patton sat idle with an army that could have been advancing. Bradley ground divisions to pieces in terrain that should have been bypassed. And 1 month later, when the Germans launched their surprise offensive, the only commander ready to react quickly was the one who had been held back by politics, while the divisions that could have responded had been destroyed in Bradley's Forest. December 16th, 1944. The debate about the Huertgen Forest became irrelevant. German forces launched their last major offensive in the West. Over 200,000 German troops smashed into American positions in the Ardennes Forest of Belgium and Luxembourg. The Germans achieved complete surprise. American intelligence had believed Germany was finished. The intelligence was catastrophically wrong. Within 48 hours, German forces had advanced 20 miles. American divisions were surrounded or routed. The entire Allied front was threatened. Bradley had insisted the Huertgen Forest offensive was necessary to protect the American advance, that controlling the high ground and the dams was essential, that German forces in the forest threatened the flank. He was wrong. The Germans didn't attack through the Huertgen Forest. They attacked through the Ardennes, terrain Bradley had considered too difficult for major German operations. The tragedy was compounded by waste. The divisions that could have stopped the German advance weren't available. The 28th Infantry Division, which had been destroyed in the Huertgen Forest weeks earlier, was holding a quiet sector in the Ardennes when the Germans attacked. They were still under strength and partially rebuilt. They couldn't hold against the German assault. Other divisions that might have been mobile reserves had been chewed up in Bradley's Forest offensive. The American response to the German offensive was hampered by the casualties Bradley's Huertgen campaign had consumed. Bradley had no strategic reserves because he had ground them to pieces, attacking worthless forest. Eisenhower reacted quickly. He sent airborne divisions to hold critical positions. He redirected forces from quiet sectors. He needed someone who could move fast and attack decisively. He called Patton. And Patton was ready. Because unlike Bradley's divisions, Third Army hadn't been destroyed in a useless forest offensive. December 19th, 1944. Eisenhower held an emergency meeting at Verdun. He asked his commanders how quickly they could respond to the German crisis. Most said days or weeks. The situation was chaotic. The weather was terrible. Moving large forces in winter would take time to organize properly. Patton said 48 hours. Everyone thought he was insane. Third Army was 100 miles south of the battle. Patton would have to disengage from current operations, turn his entire army 90 degrees north, move through winter storms, and launch a coordinated attack. Military doctrine said it couldn't be done. Patton explained he had anticipated the need. His staff had prepared contingency plans for moving Third Army north. He had 3 complete attack plans ready depending on where Eisenhower wanted him to strike. All he needed was the order. Eisenhower gave it. Patton left the meeting and immediately put his plan into motion. Third Army began disengaging from operations in eastern France. They turned north and moved through snow and ice toward the German offensive. On December 22nd, exactly 3 days after the Verdun meeting, Patton's forces attacked the southern flank of the German Bulge. It was one of the most impressive operational movements in military history. Patton moved 3 divisions, approximately 133,000 men over 100 miles in winter conditions, and launched a coordinated attack with minimal preparation time. His forces relieved the surrounded 101st Airborne at Bastogne on December 26th. Inside Bastogne, the paratroopers were running out of everything but snow. They had no winter clothes, low ammo, and were surrounded by 7 German divisions. They weren't fighting for strategy anymore. They were fighting to survive the night. When Patton's tanks finally broke through the tree line, they didn't just see armor. They saw life. They drove back German forces and eliminated the threat to the Allied front. The speed and effectiveness shocked everyone. German commanders couldn't believe American forces could reorient so quickly. British observers called it a masterpiece. Even Eisenhower admitted it was one of the war's most impressive achievements. The contrast with Bradley's performance was stark. Bradley's careful, methodical approach had ground divisions to pieces in the Huertgen Forest for months without achieving objectives. Patton's aggressive, improvisational approach turned an entire army and launched a successful offensive in 3 days. But Patton's success also raised uncomfortable questions. If Patton could move 3 divisions, 100 miles, and attack in 3 days, why had Bradley needed 5 months to advance 5 miles in the Huertgen Forest? If Patton's aggressive tactics worked so well in the crisis, why wasn't he given more authority during normal operations? The answer was political. Bradley was Eisenhower's American commander and had to be supported. Patton was the aggressive subordinate who had to be controlled. The command structure wasn't based on effectiveness. It was based on political reliability. Patton understood this. He had saved the situation Eisenhower and Bradley created through cautious strategy. If he had been given fuel and authority earlier, the Germans might not have been able to launch the offensive at all. But that's alternate history. What actually happened was that Patton's response during the Bulge rescued the situation and distracted everyone from asking why Bradley had wasted thousands of casualties in a forest that proved strategically irrelevant. Because by the time people looked back, the war was nearly over, and victory obscured the mistakes. The Battle of the Bulge ended in Allied victory. The German offensive was crushed. American forces had held impossible positions and counterattacked decisively. The public celebrated Patton's dramatic relief of Bastogne. They heard about the 101st Airborne's heroic defense. They didn't hear much about the 33,000 casualties in the Huertgen Forest. The Bulge provided perfect cover for Bradley's disaster. Public attention focused on German aggression and American resilience. The months of grinding attrition in an obscure forest didn't make headlines. This was fortunate for Bradley. The Huertgen Forest casualties were buried under the drama of the Bulge. The questions about whether the forest should have been bypassed were never seriously examined. Montgomery's Market Garden failure had been dramatic and public. 17,000 casualties in 9 days. British paratroopers surrounded and destroyed. A clear, undeniable failure. Bradley's Huertgen disaster was gradual and less visible. 33,000 casualties spread over 5 months. Multiple divisions slowly ground down rather than one airborne division spectacularly destroyed. A failure that could be obscured by subsequent events. Eisenhower never seriously considered firing Bradley, despite the casualties, despite the strategic failure, despite the obvious waste. The reasons were personal and political, not military. Bradley was Eisenhower's longest-serving subordinate. They had known each other since West Point. Bradley was loyal. He was the American commander Eisenhower trusted absolutely. More importantly, Bradley was Eisenhower's counterweight to Montgomery. The command structure required an American general with authority equal to Montgomery's. If Eisenhower fired Bradley, he would have to promote someone else. Patton was the obvious candidate. But Patton was politically toxic. He said offensive things. He competed with Montgomery openly. He ignored orders he disagreed with. So Eisenhower kept Bradley. He accepted the Huertgen casualties as the cost of the offensive. He didn't question whether Bradley's strategy had been sound. He supported his longtime friend. This was the same calculation Eisenhower had made with Montgomery after Market Garden. Political necessity outweighed military accountability. But there was a crucial difference. When Montgomery gave his arrogant press conference in January 1945, claiming credit for American victories during the Bulge, he crossed a line that battlefield failures never approached. Bradley and Patton threatened to resign. Churchill had to intervene. Eisenhower drafted the relief order for Montgomery, something he had never considered doing to Bradley. All of this happened while Huertgen Forest casualties were still being counted, while American divisions were still being rebuilt after being destroyed in Bradley's offensive. The double standard was clear. Battlefield failure from a trusted friend was acceptable. Political failure from an arrogant ally was nearly fatal. Montgomery nearly lost his command not for 17,000 battlefield casualties, but for words at a press conference. Bradley kept his command despite 33,000 casualties because Eisenhower protected him. This wasn't about military merit. It was about political necessity. Eisenhower needed Bradley as his American commander. Firing him would have required admitting the Huertgen strategy was wrong and creating a command crisis. So Bradley was protected. The casualties were explained as the cost of difficult terrain and determined enemy resistance. The strategic questions were never asked. And American families received telegrams saying their sons died heroes, which was true, but not the complete truth. The Huertgen Forest offensive officially ended in February 1945. By then, the Battle of the Bulge had overshadowed it completely. The forest had been taken after 5 months of combat. Final American casualties, 33,000. German casualties, 28,000. Nearly equal losses despite American advantages in numbers and firepower. The defenders had won the attrition battle. Military historians would later call it one of the worst American tactical decisions of World War II. The forest should have been bypassed. The dams could have been destroyed by air power. Months of attrition achieved nothing that mobile warfare couldn't have accomplished faster and cheaper. But the official histories minimized the disaster. They acknowledged heavy casualties, but framed them as inevitable costs of fighting in difficult terrain. They didn't question whether the offensive should have been fought at all. Germany surrendered May 8, 1945. The war was over. Eisenhower was celebrated as the architect of victory. Bradley was promoted to 4-star general. Montgomery was made a field marshal. The official narrative was successful coalition warfare. Disputes and difficulties were minimized. The emphasis was on unity and shared victory. But that narrative obscured costs. Thousands of soldiers had died in operations that were strategically questionable. Commanders had been protected from accountability based on political considerations rather than performance. The comparison between Montgomery and Bradley was buried in celebration. Montgomery had nearly been fired for a press conference. Bradley had kept his job despite twice the casualties. The double standard was clear but politically inconvenient to discuss. The Huertgen Forest is often a footnote in American military history, overshadowed by D-Day and the Bulge, but it remains one of the costliest mistakes of the war. Bradley's reputation as a careful, competent commander remained intact. The command structure that protected him was preserved in the post-war military. Political reliability continued to be valued over battlefield innovation. The lesson that should have been learned was never learned. Future commanders weren't taught to question frontal assaults into defended terrain. The importance of bypassing enemy strongpoints wasn't emphasized. This would have consequences in future wars. Korea, Vietnam, and later conflicts would see similar patterns. Questionable strategic decisions, heavy casualties for limited gains, political considerations preventing accountability. 33,000 telegrams meant 33,000 mothers collapsed in hallways. 33,000 empty chairs at Christmas dinner just a few weeks later. They were told their sons fell defeating tyranny. They weren't told their sons died in a forest that their own generals knew was worthless. This was true, but it wasn't the complete truth. The complete truth was that they died in a forest that should have been bypassed. They died because a commander refused to change strategy when it was clearly failing. They died because the political leadership refused to hold that commander accountable. Montgomery lost 17,000 men in a failed operation and kept his job. Then he gave one arrogant press conference and nearly got fired. Bradley lost 33,000 men in a failed operation and was promoted. The double standard was real. The political calculations were clear, and American soldiers paid the price. In the end, the lesson is brutal and simple. In coalition warfare, you can lose an army and keep your job as long as you don't lose your temper at a press conference. Political reliability matters more than battlefield results. Personal relationships protect more than performance, and soldiers pay for decisions made by commanders who are shielded from the consequences. That's the truth about the Huertgen Forest, about Bradley and Montgomery, about Eisenhower's protection of his favorite commander. And that's a truth that military histories prefer not to examine too closely, because it would require admitting that sometimes politics costs more lives than enemy action.